So today I'm going to be talking about this thing called PozQoL. Some of you may be familiar with it, some not. But things have progressed a long time since the last time I spoke about this particular scale and so forth. I'm going to be speaking about it at a couple of different levels. One aspect around its use within clinical settings, peer navigation, peer support settings. I'll also be talking a little bit about PozQoL's use in the advocacy role of achieving getting quality of life as part of Australia's national HIV strategy and so forth. But first I'd like to recognise the people living with HIV who have shared generously with their experience and purposes with research throughout the entire epidemic. Much of the fight, as we know, is actually due to the capacity of people with HIV to give up their experiences, their bodies and so forth for the fight, and also their communities. I'm also going to be talking about quality of life, and I was actually reflecting on during Jenny's speech. So as someone who's been living with HIV for 28 years, I have built a beautiful portfolio of comorbidities over that time. I am looking forward to tonight. Jenny did suggest some of those websites to check risk factors for things, so I think that's definitely something to do on a Friday night. Okay, so Jenny's a good friend, I should say. Look, just acknowledging the disclosures of one take disclosures or others, people who have invested in important research working with people living with HIV is another name for that list. Okay, so let's talk about valuing quality of life amongst people living with HIV. Now, everyone will be familiar. Admittedly, I haven't updated this particular slide, so it still talks about 90. But the key thing here is, many of you are aware, some years ago there was a movement around the 90 of what kind of things we're trying to achieve. There was a strong movement around bringing quality of life into that, around achieving good quality of life within, amongst 90% of people living with HIV. And we did quite a lot of, I suppose, rethinking around that, because really good quality of life isn't something you achieve after achieving undetectable viral load. Quality of life is both an enabler as well as an outcome. And what I mean by that is, as an outcome, quality of life is one way of actually trying to measure when we get improvements in quality of life, what that really means is decreases in stigma. It really means increases in access to good health care. It means increase in equity. That's what it's actually about. As an enabler, it's very difficult for people, as we know, to move through that cascade of care, as it's often put forward, without being actually able to have good access to health care, without being able to afford things and so forth. So it's both an input and an outcome. And that was a lot of the argument we did in Australia about trying to get quality of life more directly linked in. So I'll come back to the advocacy part. So PozQoL. PozQoL project, and what PozQoL means and what that definition is. Poz comes from the strong movement internationally and also in Australia of Poz being a term for positive people that was developed and driven by people with HIV as a term of empowerment and strength and confidence. QoL is quality of life, and because all the scales and these sorts of research things in the world always have an acronym bit in their name, so we put QoL in there just to adhere to that. So the PozQoL project was an alignment of priorities of peer organisations, clinical and community services and industry that came together way back in about 2017 to really look at, okay, so much of our time, energy and efforts is about trying to reduce stigma and improve quality of life, but we weren't able to demonstrate that actually happening. And so a lot of programs were funded for things that were measurable, not things that we're actually trying to do. It was also the feedback we had from a lot of clinicians and nurses working in the field of being able to, in a short period of time, tap into issues around quality of life, particularly as a way of getting past that conversation of, how are you? I'm fine, okay, which is the sort of usual clinical discussion. So it was developed very much by and for people living with HIV with significant support across the sector. The PozQoL scale is an empirically validated quality of life scale. It is free to use. It was developed through getting 460 people with HIV in Australia to complete a survey about creating a survey, which was not easy. But what it did do is it's been able to get us to really rethink, build on and sort of mobilise that energy that was already present within clinics and within community organisations about improving quality of life, and be able to really kind of amplify that energy, both at a national level and at a clinical level. So the PozQoL scale itself, this is actually it. So it's 13 questions on a 5-point scale. I've divided them up into the domains, so it really taps into things around health concerns, psychological, social and functional. When we actually implement it, we usually mix those questions up, okay? So we get sort of positive and negative worded questions in different ways, but this sort of gives a better feel for what it's actually about. A key thing about the PozQoL scale, I should apologise, out in the lobby there's some flyers there with a QR code that will take you to the PozQoL website, which will have everything you've wanted and everything you didn't want about PozQoL. So when it was developed, what we did was, the whole range of people with HIV. Now, I want to emphasise the people with HIV that completed the survey were as representative of people with HIV in Australia as any national online survey of people living with HIV. Okay, so it had all the benefits and challenges of that. But what we were able to do was, the way we completed it, was those 13 questions, in particular domains, effectively predict, they kind of correlate with much larger scales. So there was a whole range of general sets of questions about quality of life for people generally, not necessarily with HIV, and PozQoL correlates well with those, so it predicts those. It also correlates with other scales about living with HIV, functional tests and so forth. So what we've been able to pull together is a scale that's a little bit like a screening tool that will help identify, are there concerns that perhaps we need to talk about in more detail or explore a bit more fully. And if you're really interested, there is a, I'm an academic, of course, there's a journal paper that goes into all of that. A key bit around, I think, why PozQoL has been really effective and resonated, particularly within Australia, was the very deep involvement of people living with HIV in its full development. So that's through the conceptualisation, the development of all the questions. So what I mean by that is we had about over 100 questions that we kind of narrowed down to the 13. But also another part was people with HIV were directly involved in the actual analysis choices that we were making that allowed us to kind of embed or ensure we had both statistical rigour but the reality of lived experience and real experiences and what that would actually mean in practice. Just grab some water. So what we've got now, so that's, we're coming up to 10 years from, I think, when we first put in an application to get some funding for PozQoL. Where we're at in Australia is it's being used in most Australian community services, so peer services and welfare programs for people with HIV, and quite a rapidly increasing number of clinics, both GP clinics and hospital clinics. It's also being used in a range of organisational services, looking at ways of going beyond necessarily individuals, but okay, what's our whole cohort look like in terms of quality of life? What are the other things that we can actually engage around? And also in our national strategies, so using a national monitoring that has actually been really influential in the way programs have been developed. It has also been used internationally in a number of studies and clinical aspects, and we've now got it translated into 30 languages. So what I want to talk about first, briefly, is just some of the feedback we've had around at an individual service level and how that's been going. So in Australia, this is the range of both clinical and community organisations that are either implementing it or about to start implementing it into practice. I'll be honest, our star child is Jenny Hoy's Alfred hospital, HIV services, which you may have noticed in that tab thing. One of the little tabs that Jenny presented much earlier was quality of life, and that was PozQoL, and actually having that as part of the data that clinicians can actually see. So there's a whole range. So what I'm going to be talking about at the moment is feedback and experience I've had from discussions with all of these organisations, taking into account I do not work in a clinic, I'm not a clinical doctor, and I was just joking before, in fact, I only really deal with whole communities. I don't know what to deal with individuals. So I don't want to present myself as knowledgeable of all things of how clinics actually work. So the feedback we've had so far is, what's been really interesting is how generally PozQoL gets implemented would be, I'll explain that a little bit later, but patients complete it before a clinical appointment. And so it's really the clinicians looking at the results with the patient. What they've generally found is clients, and also with peer navigators, but more so these first few points very much with clients, it's been identifying clients who may not otherwise be identified. Most clinicians, and when I'm saying clinicians, I'm actually meaning doctors, nurses, social workers, so any sort of working within that clinical setting. Most know there's patients who are absolutely struggling. Where it's been more difficult, feedback and where they found it really useful, is tapping in and identifying patients who on paper look like they're going fine, but actually aren't. And what we're able to do with PozQoL is, because it's not just the scores, but because we can compare it to national data, we can have that conversation of saying, gee, I notice here on the social domain, you know, your scores seem a lot lower than other people living with HIV in Australia. So it's not a judgment one way or another, but it's just saying, is that, you know, perhaps that's something to have a talk about, and it opens up some things around potential referrals and so on. The other part has been, particularly amongst heterosexual and migrant clients, has been, they know, like for a lot of the clients, know their quality of life is not good, but they're assuming this is as good as it gets. And so it's been really useful to be able to challenge that, saying, well, actually, with these different programs, we've had a lot of success and so forth, and sort of challenging that very ingrained belief. Very briefly, the other thing was really just for most clients, it's been a really clear message that quality of life was something that should be talked about as part of your overall healthcare or overall peer navigation experience and so on. The other part that we're finding now is it's increasing and improving effective referral. So you can imagine saying to someone, gee, I think, you know, seeing someone, say peer support or peer navigator might be really useful. Often that's someone says, no, I'm fine. But if it comes after a discussion of actually most people with HIV are doing a bit better, there are things you can do, the referral becomes a lot stronger. I might just move quickly forward because I'm waffling. The most common implementation within clinical settings, just so it's clear, is prior to the appointment, usually using an electronic tool of some sort, which we've got. There's a free one that's been developed that is fully accessible for New Zealand that I can show you. And usually it's once or twice a year. We are now starting in Australia to emerge where clients may be in a situation where a number of services that they're accessing are getting them to complete PozQoL once or twice a year. So we are working in the sense of seeing how we can actually minimise that. So you can imagine with peer navigation, welfare clinics, where there's some partnership work that we need to sort of work on there. With community services, most often standard part of intake, and a range of sort of other things, and certainly evaluating targeted programs. So particularly around workshops, retreats, or other sorts of initiatives over time. Because of the validity in the psychometrics with PozQoL, a change in PozQoL over time we know is a real change. It's not just because one day they happen to be feeling better than another. We've done the sort of the retest test processes to see that basically it's a pretty reliable predictor of actual change. Certainly the other bit I'd say is the experience that's come through the lesson has been nurses and peer navigators having a particularly critical role. Always have been within quality of life. And part of that is it's an opportunity to kind of take that quality of life discussion a bit further. And obviously nurses in some peer navigator contexts often lead or support care plan processes and so forth. Very briefly, the PozQoL website, it's just a snapshot from it. has a whole range of details, and we're putting up everything that we learn about its use and different ways as quickly as we can. We've also developed a range of tools and so forth that can be quite useful. Most of the tools are in Word, so you can actually adapt them and so forth. And these are the languages that it's currently being translated into. The logic of how these got chosen is a mystery. Partly it was people contacting me from different countries saying we'd like to translate PozQoL, and I said, sure. And so all of them have gone through either a formal translation process, so the formal system of translation forward and backwards and community checking and so forth, and those where we weren't certain that had gone through the full process, we then paid to get rechecked and so on. So we're quite confident with all of these languages, but totally open to other languages that we might want to pop on our list and look at ways that we can achieve that. It's only in Turkish, Spanish and a couple of others have we analysed the data to check that all the psychometrics still work. There are a huge range of cultures here, and I cannot say that PozQoL 100% resonates with quality of life in every one of those cultures. So as I mentioned before, there is a digital tool that our friends at ViV Healthcare have helped us develop. So I won't go through the whole tool, but just a couple of quick screenshots. That basically, all those QR codes will come back at the end. Basically, it's a tool where someone goes on, they choose their language. Admittedly, they're choosing their language in English. It's a challenge, but generally what we're finding is most people with PozQoL in Australia that are using PozQoL in another language, the most likely scenario is that they're more comfortable doing it in that language than having no English capacity. So that's if you know what I mean. And so it goes through and it then generates the PozQoL score. This website does not save any data whatsoever at any level. All it does is allow you to complete the scores, complete the survey, generates the scores, and allows you to either email those scores directly to your GP or peer navigator, or creates a PDF that you can save and take with you, but nothing gets saved online. Turns that A, we don't want to go down that path of saving people's data, and secondly, it keeps the data very much within the hands of the person with HIV, and they're deciding who gets to see it. Also, our friends at Gilead have been working with us, and they've developed a similar website that's more tailored in terms of it's badged as a particular clinic's website, and we're trialling a bit of that to see if does that actually support people's confidence and so on. So the other part, just briefly, how am I going for time? Anyway, we'll see. The other thing I was going to touch base on really quickly, because I'm not sure if this may be of interest to people. At an organisational level, I'm not going to talk about different evaluation processes. What did come up with both community organisations and some of the clinics was what we'd been able to create was a momentum around PozQoL where we had a whole lot of community organisations and clinics using the same tool, talking the same language around quality of life. So there was a bit of momentum there. And so what we started to talk about is, okay, are there other questions across research, across clinics, government, community organisations, other scales that might be good to complement PozQoL? PozQoL, as I said before, is like an outcome of quality of life, but it doesn't tap into the detail. And so what we tried to look at is, could we possibly get a consensus across, and PROM means patient-reported outcome measure. It's a term, it refers to actually asking patients or clients how they feel. It's a technical way of saying that. What we want to go is, there's a whole lot of scales around, you can imagine around, say, financial vulnerability, around home security and housing, and a whole range of other issues that are impacting directly on people with HIV. What we did find briefly was we had a whole range of support programs for people with HIV, and there was about 14 different ways that resilience was being measured across Australia, which makes it really difficult to start thinking about what does that actually mean more broadly. So we thought, can we get a consensus across all these different disciplines? I won't go through all the details, but we started with 147 different scales across, well-being, physical well-being, social, cognitive treatment, welfare, lifestyle, safety, and so forth. We went through a Delphi process, which is basically a little bit like a French election, where you kind of vote, and then the bottom ones get dropped off, and you vote again, and the bottom ones get dropped off, and so forth. So we went through that with 40 different people across those different areas to see, okay, of all these different already written, validated scales about all these different issues, which ones might be the most practical and useful within community and clinical programs? And we got it down to 18. And it was across two groups, very briefly, and I've got some flyers on this. The top one was the ones that across all of those different areas, there was very strong consensus. Okay, so it was like saying, okay, if we're going to ask a question about social connections, this is the one that everyone seems to think would work well. Level B were the ones where it was very highly rated within particular services, primarily because that was an issue they were kind of dealing with. What that looks like is this, where across the top were the ones where we kind of felt that works pretty well as a set, and then the other ones really were around, say, housing and so forth, tended to be more with services where that was actually something they were engaging with and so on. PozQoL was put in here not as an assumption, but as something that got rated and scaled. I did a big sigh of relief when PozQoL rated well. So what we found was basically it's the total score and the domains came up, and we got good consensus that seemed like a good initial screening process for those. The two others that came up that high, which I think was really interesting, one was around treatment satisfaction. So that wasn't about particular treatments, but more about just treatment in your life and how that's going. The other one was that there's a large-scale bunch of questions around stigma, and there's kind of a subscale, like a domain within that, around disclosure. And that was the one that came up really strongly, partly because I think what came through was across most of the services, helping people with disclosure was one of the aspects of stigma they could actually work with. You can't do a lot on a one-on-one basis about the rest. So that was something that came up across all those different areas. And then Group B was really around all the sort of other areas that were clearly a priority, but it kind of depended on what your service was. So what we generally suggest with this, if it's of interest, is the top one is kind of like a really useful set, the green, and the orange is kind of like a pick and choose kind of one. This is the full report's available with all the scales and the references and so forth of interest. To be clear, this is not something that in Australia has to be used. It was a consensus of it's really that kind of idea of if you're going to be asking people with HIV questions within a service, here are some ones that most services think are probably quite useful. It's probably the best way to think around it. The last bit I want to talk about was sort of take our view a bit more national and just talk about the involvement of PozQoL within strengthening the state and national and territory strategies within Australia. So I do note the National Action Plan, deep down in 1H, I think. So basically it was under increasing regular and consistent monitoring. I was very excited to see there around developing a framework that would actually be looking at consistent monitoring of people, of the experiences of people living with HIV, and I think particularly seeing quality of life within there as one of those outcomes that's an important part of that overall mix, and also around patient-reported outcomes. And also in the New Zealand HIV monitoring plan, number 42, but deep down. But what I was interested there was around, this was under the air of, one of the key challenges we had in Australia as well was there was a very clear policy directive of we cannot have any objectives or targets in the strategy of something that we're not already measuring. So it was interesting, that dynamic between we want a bold, forward-looking national strategy in Australia, but we can't do anything that we're not already doing. Anyway, it was kind of the idea. So reason I'm sort of highlighting the New Zealand one was just, I suppose, to highlight the importance of quality of life and having a measure that might actually help progress different things. What we do have at the moment, our current strategy, which did actually end in 2022. Our next one is apparently going to be 2023 to 2030, but we are in 2024. But anyway, 75% of people living with HIV report a good quality of life. Now, where that came from, in the PozQoL scale, good is basically 3 or more. It was a bit of an arbitrary thing. For those that are familiar with PozQoL, you'll see it goes, the general scores we have is low, low, moderate, high, very high. Good is actually moderate, but there was no way we were going to get 75% of people living with HIV report moderate quality of life in a national strategy. So we came up with the word good, but I just want to be emphasised, good means, you know, you're getting by, okay? Yeah, anyway. But it's probably insensitive, it's probably not something that needs intervention, is probably another way to think about it. But particularly, 75% of people report reduced by 75%, people reporting experiences of stigma. One of the things I'd want to really emphasise, just in sense of advocacy within New Zealand, is the danger of delinking stigma and quality of life. They're not the same thing, but they are related. And a key thing I suppose I'd want to emphasise is, for example, someone with a really high level of quality of life that also is very open and out about their HIV status may actually experience a lot of stigma, but it may not impact on them as much. Someone who is spending a lot of energy, emotional energy, hiding their HIV status may not have direct experiences of stigma, but it's massively impacting on their quality of life. So the two are complementary, and my strong encouragement would be to be thinking around changes in quality of life and stigma together when tackling that as a broader issue. So certainly in Australia, what we did find is we've got, as many of you know, we have a study called HIV Futures. It's been running about every 3 years since 1997. To emphasise, every time we've run it, it could have been the last time. So every time is new funding. It's never been funded multiple times. But we did obviously strategically line it up. Where it's been most useful for advocacy is having it near the beginning and the end of a strategy. So, for example, if there's any work happening or if there's any, I don't know, stigma campaigns or things that might be happening soon. What I'd emphasise is it's really useful to get some level of data first and after. The impact, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself a bit. So HIV Futures is every 3 years. I've got a bit of data here to show from 2019 and 2022. So 2019 was the first time we actually had PozQoL in HIV Futures because it's only just been developed. What we did find is between 2009 and 2022, we went from 63% to almost 72% of people reporting, kind of hitting that 3 out of 5 measure within PozQoL. Now, the problem with that is it does mask a lot of diversity within that sample, and what's been really useful with Futures is being able to unpack within that sort of 72% who's doing well and who's being left behind. And it's been particularly when we start looking in terms of heterosexuals living with HIV, rural, very similar scenarios, migrant communities, very similar kind of demographics and experiences that aspects of New Zealand's having, you know, in sense of who's actually not hitting that quality of life aspect. That's been particularly useful in being able to advocate for changes in strategies, reorientating programs and so forth. So it's really the HIV Futures data generally as a basis, and then bringing in PozQoL and having kind of a measurable aspect around quality of life has been quite key to a lot of the advocacy that we've been able to achieve. The next piece in sense of our draft Australian National HIV Strategy, which has been soon to be released for, I think it's 18 months. Anyway, it's meant to come out very soon, but what we have seen is we've been able to advocate, because of the changes we've had, because we had the data, a genuine commitment to having 95% of people with HIV reporting a good quality of life by 2030. When we achieve that sort of thing, it does create quite an enabling environment. I'm not saying it's suddenly funding flowed or anything, but people will, bureaucrats will take your meeting, if you know what I mean, like you can get in. So one of the things I want to say is I've spoken about PozQoL at a couple of different levels. PozQoL is not a diagnostic tool. We don't diagnose people with a good or bad quality of life. At an individual level, where my colleagues working in community organisations and clinics have said it's been most useful, is kind of like a high-level screening tool that helps take the conversation past that initial, I'm fine scenario, and also being able to help direct what other things we might want to actually talk about in more detail. At an organisational level, it's been really useful in organisations being able to get a better sense of their cohort, who they're reaching, who they're not reaching, and so on. And again, informing decisions to improve health outcomes, it's been quite useful that at an individual level, but also at a state and national advocacy level. That's it. Oh, I've got 5 minutes. Okay. So they're the QR codes that I spaced around. So thank you. Okay, got 5 minutes for questions. Were there any questions? Let's go. No?
You said you were using the tool before the clinic. So, what was the percentage of people filling out the tool? Yes. Like, those, often we give those tools to our clients or patients, but they're very reluctant to engage. So, what is your I don't know.
Yeah, the feedback I've had of in terms of the really practical and who completes and so forth. So the best thing to say is we've been working with a few clinics for a while. What we did find, so those using the digital tool, so there would be clinics where they sent it out either an email or a text, said, hey, your next appointment's coming up. Be great if you could complete this beforehand. Where it works best is if a clinician was saying, hey, look, next appointment, we're going to talk about your broader health, that kind of thing. So set it up that way. As part of us being able to help you achieve better life and outcomes, this is a really useful tool. If it comes across as though they're completing the tool as a favour to the clinic or some weird research study, that'll kill it. Okay, so it needs the patients. They need to know there's a purpose for it. Generally, what we found was then the clinics. What I did do is we basically got a bunch of tablets so that some of the clinics could have tablets where if patients hadn't got around to completing it, could do it there and then in the clinic and just take the results in with them on the tablet. So that created that shifted a lot. The largest barrier we have, look, Jenny's disclosed this before. They've had great success at the Alfred in implementing PozQoL through that kind of system, but the great success is with a minority of clinicians. The largest barrier we have is the two things. One is clinicians feeling confident that doing this is not going to suddenly create a whole different conversation in a short appointment. What we generally find is when it's set up of this particular appointment, we're going to be looking at, your cholesterol, the whole gamut. It makes more sense both for the appointment and for the patient and the clinician, and that's when it works well. Yeah. Yep. Oh, I'm not sure. I'll let you guys decide.
Thanks so much, Graham. I think it's really great. It's really exciting. My question is how much or what your experiences of using this in Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, and whether there's sort of a different, how they react to it, whether there's a different perspective, and I guess potentially leading on from that, how that might then be adapted for Māori in New Zealand. Maybe that's going a wee bit too far, but particularly for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, I'd be really interested to hear your experience.
So certainly our experience, and I'm more comfortable sort of, to some extent, providing some of the feedback I've had. I'm not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander in the sense, so I wouldn't be able to give a proper sort of feedback in that sense. But the experience of the feedback I've had so far is a couple of things. One, there's some really great work that's happened in Australia around clinical yarning. I'm not sure if that's a term you're familiar with, that sort of thing. So I think we need to keep, and that's with any community working out, keep in mind PozQoL is a tool to try and engage around quality of life. And so the focus of that is how do we engage around quality of life, PozQoL being one of those tools, if that makes sense. So generally, and I think it'd be similar with some of the peer navigation programs, the point I was going to make was for a lot of services that are working at a much sort of deeper or cultural level, PozQoL is not the first thing. You wouldn't use it in your first appointment when you're trying to build rapport at a cultural level. If it's useful, we've got a couple of First Nation nurses and health workers that have been trying it out a little bit, but I would say the results are inconclusive, and it's really about tailoring at that. It is a scale that was developed with a predominantly white European sample, of which about 10% of the sample didn't fit that description. So, yeah. Yep.
I just wanted to touch on, you were talking about MIPA was used as the framework to develop PozQoL, which is like great. You know, the HIV action plan was really this government's first attempt at MIPA. And so like from developing PozQoL and using MIPA as a framework, I find that a lot of organizations that are attracted by MIPA and the idea of, you know, actually talking to people and learning about their experiences, you know, novel idea. But more so, they don't know how to do it. You know, how do you do MIPA? And so I was wondering if there's any learnings that the researchers had of scaffolding this framework and then actually implementing it.
Sorry, I think the first time I got asked that was as a researcher. Start with a 10-year trusting relationship. Step one. But no, I'm being sorry. So yeah, like the capacity to be able to meaningfully involve people in PozQoL didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, so that came out of a lot of back and forth and a lot of, you know, good and bad times to relationships over, you know, and all of that sort of thing. So that's a big part of it. But in terms of involvement was I suppose one of the things we did do was from a research study point of view, we actually, our ethics application actually framed that right up the top. So it basically said why we're involving all these other people that may not fit the criteria of being researchers on a study, and making it very clear that that was integral to how the project, how it needed to run to do good science. So that from a research study was really key. The other part that I think comes in strongly was in that study being able to reference the national HIV strategy and make comments like, you know, in order to be compliant with the national HIV strategy, we will be doing this in this way and so forth. In terms of the actual practice of it, it was really about keeping flexible. I've done other sort of discussions around, from a research point of view, and I think from program point of view, is really engaging with the fact that peer organisations and peer-based programs are drawing from communities under a lot of pressure. And so the whole structure needs to be based around the fact that you may not be able to have the same people involved all the way through. There will be people who will have to move in and out. Things will need to be flexible. And arguing to actually, if we're going to do this properly, it's not just about inviting people to be on an advisory committee, but it's about structuring the whole project, which meant when we're doing the analysis, there were times the whole analysis had to stop for 3-4 weeks because we were not going to take the next step until we had some meaningful involvement. And that's challenging to build into it, but that's the sort of thing that needs to happen rather than just bringing people into an already existing structure. It frustrated the hell out of me. I'll be honest, it was very frustrating having to stop a project for a month, but deep down I knew that was the only thing we could do. The other quick point I should say is, me as a researcher living with HIV, making it very clear to research centres and others that that does not mean I have or represent all the experiences of people living with HIV, and me being on the project does not tick that box, I suppose. Yeah. Sorry. Thank you.